the United States is the most warmongering nation in the history of the world. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host, S.L. Canton. The quote that you heard was not uttered by Xi Jinping or Putin, but by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. The U.S. has not waged wars for only 16 out of its 248 years of existence. With such aggression programmed in its DNA, the U.S. empire will be extremely dangerous over the next decade as the American century comes to an end. Thus, India must stay vigilant and avoid getting sucked into the vortex of American manipulations. Indians must understand what is happening now in Ukraine and the Middle East and what destruction the US is planning in Asia. Big picture. In a nutshell, the USA wants to reestablish the unipolar moment it enjoyed for at least 2 decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. This fantasy of a hyperpower America being the unrivaled leader in military, economy, technology, finance, soft power, etc., started to crumble after the 2008 financial crisis. Since then, there has been an enormous shift in power from the West to the East, from developed countries to developing countries, and from the US-centric world to a multipolar world. Russia and China have become great powers, and India is on its way to becoming the third largest economy. BRICS is expanding rapidly to establish an alternative to the American economic and financial systems. And de-dollarization is accelerating in every corner of the world. China's Belt and Road Initiative has 150 members who share the Global South vision of development, connectivity, peace, and cooperation. Multipolar world is the buzz phrase on everyone's lips. The US is no longer number one in manufacturing, exports, trade, technology, middle class population, patents, and scientific papers. On the other hand, Chinese cities are futuristic, high tech, safe, clean, efficient, and boast amazing infrastructure, while American cities look old and are full of homeless tents. People in communist China are now living longer than those in capitalist America. In terms of military, Russia and China have hypersonic missiles, which have eluded the American defense companies. African countries like Niger and Mali are expelling the US military and are seeking security deals with Russia, which has managed to defeat the combined might of the US and Europe in Ukraine. In summary, Pax Americana is dying right before our eyes. American desperation. In a logical world, the US would do 2 things. 1, accept the rise of a multipolar world and work with Russia, China, Iran, India, and others to formulate a new economic and security architecture. Number 2, fix America's numerous problems such as debt, inequality, poverty, low quality of education, high cost of living, especially in healthcare, housing, and college education, corrupt politics, and so on. Instead, the empire managers are doubling down on hybrid and kinetic wars. The imperialist only goal is to stay number one, and their only solution is to cripple the competitors. What Indians must realize is that the US will gladly sacrifice its so-called allies to maintain its primacy. We can see the philosophy when Americans talk about how the aid to Ukraine is the best investment, since Ukrainians will fight Russia to the last man. In other words, if millions of Ukrainians die in order to weaken or defeat Russia, it will be considered a victory for the US. Now think about the analogous situation in India. If 100 million Indians, Japanese, and Filipinos die in a nuclear war against China, that will be celebrated in the US media. As a consolation prize, the US will build monuments and maybe publish books about the greatest generation in Asia. How World War II made America great. By the way, such destruction is how the US became a global power. In the 1930s, the US was mired in the Great Depression. It was only World War II that changed the American destiny. Manufacturing weapons for Europe immensely boosted the American economy. The Americans were also clever enough to not get involved for much of the war. The famous Normandy invasion came 5 years after the World War II began. When the war ended 1 year later, the US took credit for defeating Hitler when it was the Soviet Union that destroyed 70 to 80% of the Nazi military and also sacrificed 27 million lives. Also conveniently forgotten are the facts that US banks and US corporations like IBM, GM, Ford, Rockefeller's oil companies, etc., heavily invested in Hitler's Germany all through the 1930s. More importantly, the US involvement in World War II had nothing to do with saving the world or fighting fascism. President Truman succinctly explained American calculations when he said this. If we see that Germany is winning the war, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And in that way, let them kill as many as possible. Such American ruthlessness is terrifying. And guess what? Within a month after Hitler's death, Churchill had formalized Operation Unthinkable, which involved American and British forces attacking the USSR, which was the ally during World War II. Even more shocking was the plan to recruit the Nazis in this attack. Think about that for a minute. The Anglo-American Empire has no moral compass. It's all about power and wealth. Life has no value and morality has no meaning. However, the entire American society and the world have been brainwashed by Hollywood with narratives of a noble America fighting fascism to spread freedom and democracy. The winners write the history. Unfortunately, Europe and Asia now seem oblivious to the American playbook. Europeans are getting ready to start another full-blown war with Russia. Incredible. In Asia, some countries like Japan and the Philippines are rushing to the altar of suicide to fight China on behalf of the US. The worst nightmare for America is India and China working together. Imagine 3 billion people cooperating in harmony and lifting each other up. Zooming out, an Asia that disavows war and focuses on development and prosperity will be terrible news for the American empire. The bigger picture of a peaceful Eurasia is the most dreadful scenario for the globalist rulers of the USA. Ukraine War, a window into US foreign policy. William Blum, a great American historian and author of two seminal books on US foreign policy, wrote thus: if you flip over the rock of American foreign policy of the past century, this is what crawls out: invasions, bombings, overthrowing governments, occupations, suppressing movements for social change, assassinating political leaders, perverting elections, manipulating labor unions, manufacturing news, death squads, torture, biological warfare, depleted uranium, drug trafficking, and mercenaries. His book, Killing Hope: U.S. Military and CIA Interventions Since World War II, is a must read. The Ukraine conflict is almost an exemplary case of Blum's description of U.S. foreign policy. American foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine involves deception, betrayal, subversion, and extreme propaganda. For example, Western media have consistently used certain emotional words regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the media pundits and the masses repeat them like parrots ad nauseum. Here is how they're used. Number one, Russia's invasion was unprovoked. Ukraine is a democracy. Ukraine is a sovereign nation. However, every one of those claims is the precise opposite of the truth. In fact, the US has been using Ukraine to provoke Russia for a long time. For example, in 2019, Ukraine amended its constitution to include NATO membership as a goal, which was clearly a stated red line for Russia. Ukrainian politicians have also repeatedly talked about even acquiring nuclear weapons. Zelensky gave a speech about this just a few days before the Russian invasion in 2022. The US spent tens of millions of dollars building biowarfare labs in Ukraine, and these labs were run by the US Pentagon, not your innocent research facilities. NATO has now admitted that it has been training Ukrainian soldiers and arming them since 2014. As for Ukrainian sovereignty, the US EU orchestrated the Maidan coup, the fake revolution, in 2014 and overthrew a democratically elected popular leader. His only fault was to be pro-Russia. Remember how John McCain flew to Kiev and gave a speech at the Maidan? Later, he and Senator Lindsey Graham visited Ukraine many times, and in 2016 told Ukrainian soldiers, "Your fight against Russia is our fight." They also said that the fight against Russia would start in 2017. It was delayed only by Trump's election in 2016. The first coup by the US was actually a decade before the Maidan coup. In 2004, the US orchestrated a color revolution, the Orange Revolution. When a pro-Russia leader won, the grassroots organizations funded by George Soros cried foul, demanded a new election, and got the pro-US leader installed. Soros openly admits that his group has spent billions of dollars in Ukraine since the 1990s. In 2014, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland admitted that the U.S. government spent $5 billion in Ukraine to spread democracy. What this really means is spreading propaganda, recruiting pro-US grassroots organizations, bribing politicians, etc. Ukraine turned viciously anti-Russian over the last decade. Ethnic Russians make up about 40% of Ukraine's population, but they have been facing incredible persecution. Since 2014, Ukraine has banned Russian language TV, radio stations, websites, books, and courses in schools and universities. Pro-Russian political parties have been banned. Politicians, businessmen, and celebrities who were considered pro-Russia were arrested or driven out of the country. In smaller towns, people get assassinated if they were thought to be traitors, that is, pro-Russia. It was no wonder that Russians in Crimea and Donbass wanted to secede from Ukraine. While Crimea was lucky enough to have its own referendum, the people in Donbass were subjected to bombing for 8 years, which killed 14,000 ethnic Russians. All this is tragic, considering that Russia-Ukraine ties go back centuries. However, in the divide and rule playbook of the US empire, such cruel tactics are indispensable. A true democracy would not allow extremists to become mainstream. In Ukraine, Nazism is glorified openly. Paramilitary groups such as the Azov Battalion use Nazi symbols, and Ukrainian soldiers are seen with Nazi paraphernalia all the time. There are numerous mainstream articles and documentaries on Nazis in Ukraine, although everyone pretends to have amnesia now. The most famous Ukrainian Nazi collaborator was Stepan Bandera, who also killed numerous Jews and Polish people. Guess what? Now his birthday is an official holiday in Ukraine, and there are statues for him all over the country. Ukraine is run by oligarchs and foreigners. There's no democracy or sovereignty. The elections are useless and scripted like a Hollywood movie. And puppet comedian Zelensky recently canceled the elections, which were supposed to happen in March 2024. However, all these American shenanigans started decades ago. The US has been working with Ukrainian Nazis and ultranationalists since the late 1940s. The CIA, under Operation Aerodynamic, brought many of these extremists to the US and Canada. And some of them are very successful. For example, Canada's Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is the granddaughter of a Nazi collaborator from Ukraine. In the late 1990s, geopolitical wizard Brzezinski, also an advisor to Presidents Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama, wrote in his book that Ukraine must be brought into the US sphere of influence and into NATO by 2020. Brzezinski went on to say how this would end the Russian Empire. Yeah, Putin must have read that book as well. Bringing Ukraine into NATO was a subset of NATO expansion, which itself was a violation of trust and promises. When Soviet leaders agreed to peacefully dissolve their nation, they hoped to become a part of the Western world. However, the US stabbed Russians in the back and tried to destroy the Russian economy, society, and military in the 1990s. Later, the US kept expanding NATO, 16 countries so far, and a few more in the waiting. This blatantly violated the promise that US officials repeatedly made to Gorbachev, and that was NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. Declassified documents released in 2017 reveal how every major Western leader assured Russia numerous times that NATO would not expand after 1990. These leaders included US President Bush, the senior, German Chancellor Kohl, French President Mitterrand, UK Prime Minister Thatcher, and NATO Secretary General Warner. The American imperialist objective is conquest of Russia and has been so for decades. If you look at the bigger picture of globalists and empires, their objectives have been the same for centuries, starting with Napoleon in 1812, 200 plus years ago, and the British-French attack on Crimea in the 1850s, the US funding and arming of Japan against Russia in 1904, and so on. It does not matter how many hundreds of millions die and how many nations get destroyed. They're all just pawns. India-China relations. To the dismay of American imperialists, India-China relations are quickly improving. A recent article in The Economist talks about how the calm in the Himalayas, diplomatic charm offensives, and thickening trade links between the two Asian giants. In a Newsweek interview, Indian Prime Minister Modi described relations with China as important and strategic. Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh said that border talks are progressive and satisfactory, and no fresh tension has come up. The new Chinese ambassador, Xu Feihong, is also on a charm offensive and has been well received in India so far. As The Economist put it, the driving forces behind the rapprochement are pragmatic considerations, like India's urgent need for Chinese technology, investment, and expertise to meet its industrial needs. For example, Indian seaports are using Chinese cranes. Indian conglomerate JSW is forming a joint venture with Chinese state-owned SAIC to manufacture electric cars. Tata is partnering with Vivo to make smartphones. Reliance is partnering with Shein, the Chinese fast fashion giant, and so on. Imagine the opportunities if 3 billion people work in peace and harmony. The sky is the limit. Conclusion. The Indian government talks about how the world is a family. We need to treat that as a foreign policy and not just a platitude. Ancient religions like Hinduism and Confucianism emphasize harmony and order. It's called dharma in Sanskrit and he in Chinese, which is a very different philosophy from the American Western imperialism. Of course, Christianity also teaches about loving your neighbor and even your enemy, but the Western elites forgot it long time ago. The warmongering American paradigm is also reflected in their parasitic economic model, which has hollowed out the middle class, neglected infrastructure, created unsustainable debt, and manifested perpetual wars all over the world. In spite of all the privileges of an empire, a majority of Americans are financially broke, physically sick, and mentally unhappy. The empire treats its own people as an enemy and thus deploys divide and rule strategy against Americans. The result is that the country is now deeply polarized and faces a potential civil war. India needs to realize that America is not a permanent friend and China is not a permanent enemy. Every conflict has a diplomatic, peaceful, and win-win solution. This can be an Asian century, but only if Asian countries reject American warmongering and instead pursue a path of peace and prosperity. The end. Thank you. Please like and subscribe to Geopolitics Demystified. Bye for now.